Step 6 is exciting because we're actually starting to see the dress all come together now. What you want to do is get the back with the top stitching if you've done that, and the skirt attached and the pocket bags facing outwards, and just ensure that you trim any loose threads as well. It will make the next step easier, so just get rid of any top stitch threads if you can. And then you're going to place the top of the dress on to the back, right sides downwards, and what you're matching up, we're going to sew from the end of the underarm right here to this join, down the side seams, around the pocket bags if you've included them, and then right down to the hem. So it's a long seam. I recommend always starting here on both sides and working downwards when you're stitching to make the garment hang nicely, and to pin your crucial points. So I would begin by pinning your underarm here, and you want this seam to be matching at 5/8 of an inch where you're going to be stitching. So don't just ensure that it matches on the end, actually ensure that at your seam allowance they're also aligned, and pin it there. I guess I'm good at gauging 5/8 because I've done it a lot, but if not, just use a tape measure or a seam gauge. And then from there you can now pin the underarm. It's better, even if this is slightly misaligned from cutting out, it's better to keep these together because you've got a bit of room for manoeuvre when you hem your sleeves at the end. So I'm just pinning vertically, and then I can take those out as I remove them. And then your bust starts pressed nicely and is facing downwards. Once you've pinned here, really the next key point is your pivot points here. I've marked them with tailor tacks at the beginning, and now I've just also put a big white chalk cross so that I really can't miss them. And you want to ensure that they match up between your front and your back, and pop a pin in there. And then the rest of that seam will fit nicely, and you can pop some pins in. When you are machining this, you come down to this point, and this is where you pivot, so you keep the needle in and turn, and then you're at 5/8, the same seam allowance, to come along and sew all around the pocket bag, back onto the dress at your next pivot point, and right down to the bottom. Obviously, if the pocket wasn't there, you would sew this seam at 5/8 of an inch all the way down. And the important point to remember if you haven't got the pocket is that when you're sewing the join here, the front and back dress, that you get that panel starting at the right point, because that will be very visible from the outside. If you're just sewing the top version of the Riley, then when it comes to attaching the underarm seam, from the inside you pin so that these points here match under the arm first, and then you actually sew it in one go from the edge of the sleeve there along and down. It's always better to sew in the direction that the garment's going to hang, so to go from the top here downwards towards the waist. I'm sewing around the curve of the pocket bag, and the seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch. I find it really helpful to have this piece of tape just to keep that seam allowance really visible. And what you might need to do when you're sewing around the curve is just go slowly and keep turning. So really I'm trying to keep the front of the foot here level with the, at that point now I'm trying to keep it level with the tape at 5/8 of an inch, like so. And if you need to, you can also just, if the needle's down, lift the presser foot and just ease it round a little bit as well, like that. I'm coming to the point now where the pocket bag is coming back onto the skirt, so I'm keeping my seam allowance at 5/8, and as you get up to this point, you just need to pause, ensure that the side seams of the pockets are facing in the right direction, and then you're aiming towards the pivot point, which in my basting thread is just here. So I'm keeping my seam allowance, but I'm also now working towards that pivot point, and I'm going to pause when my needle is on the pivot point and make sure the needle's down, lift up the presser foot and turn around, and then I will be back on the 5/8 seam allowance, and I've now got a straight run down to the bottom. If you want to at this stage, you can go forward and just do a little back stitch to secure that turning point, because that's where your hand's going into the pocket, so it gets a little bit of wear, and then you just work your way down to the bottom of the skirt.